Hi everyone. Do you want me to use a microphone, or is this okay? It's okay. Yeah, so I was testing the sound, but that's already one of the games we made. That's actually the game I made with Jonatan while Sauce was making a Doom piano. It's also cool. Nobody ever talks about it. Maybe it's not as cool as the Doom piano. But let me just find. Yeah, and Jonatan actually said in a video I can show you later if you want, he said human beings are the best fake intelligences. That's one of my favorite thoughts about local multiplayer games. So yeah, experiments in local multiplayer. I've made several. I'll show you a list after this slide. And so many of them have really taught me something really specific. So this will be a little bit of a thrown together bragging about some of the projects I've done. Like Rami told me, and now I feel awkward about it. He says, "You're just gonna brag about your shit." I was like, "Yeah, kind of."
He tells it to everyone, don't worry.
What's that?
He tells it to everyone.
He's not here, is he?
Yeah, he's...
So yeah, I'm Johan. I'm from Belgium. I've lived in Copenhagen for the last 3 years. That's how I got into games. I have a Danish company called Glitchnap. I'm part of the Copenhagen Game Collective and the House of Indie in Antwerp. I do a lot of events, and other than that, I make games all the time. Some background: I'm not in it for the money, which will be pretty immediately obvious when I talk about how many games I've actually launched. I make games and toys and art to explore, and sharing and talking about this is really important to me. So these are local multiplayer games I've made. The ones on the left are not jams, so those are like bigger projects, and then those are game jam games. Lazy Nights is the only one that's actually for sale on Ouya, but we're working on more. And there's some physical games. Mid Rowdy is a game where you wear boxing gloves or oven mitts and you fight over a coin on the floor. It's really impossible to do. So it's a local multiplayer game, right? But it's not really a video game. And I made a bunch of installations, arcade machines, and they're usually also multiplayer stuff. And we'll get into some specifics.
Pants?
What's that?
Pants.
The pants are not on there. Yeah, me and Sauce made pants, but yeah, if we have time. So yeah, here's some pictures of games. This is actually here in the pool, 2 days ago. This is one of my installations, or our installations. So yeah, when I say me, or when I did something, it could be either one of these 3 organizations. So I can't take credit for everything, unfortunately. Putting stuff in the baby stroller. This is the oven mitt coin fighting game. The chain jam. And I'll get back to that, but I want to start with Lazy Nights. So Lazy Nights was the first game we made. It's also the first game the only game we've released. We wanted to make a classic retro 4-player arcade game, and the main reason we wanted to make it 4-player was because none of us really wanted to program AI, because we had no idea how, or make levels or anything, and we just realized anything you do with another person is inherently fun. Like especially video games, we're so used to just like approach this computer and have fun, even when the game is totally broken. So we thought like we can get away with anything, right? So we started making this game, and of course 4-player keyboard input is near impossible. So we started using controllers, and after like the initial prototypes, we ended up in this situation. Does this look familiar? Has anybody ever made local multiplayer games and ended up here? Yeah. Right? So very soon we started realizing like that something's happening to this space. We're obviously making it really inconvenient. Like we could put the laptop higher, or we could all sit down. But like and then you notice the difference between sitting down and standing up. You use a space in a completely different way. So what we did when we started testing with other people than ourselves, this is us, you can tell. When we started testing with other students in our university, we actually found a derelict arcade somewhere in a bar and put our game totally smoke and mirrors. We just put a computer screen behind the plexi and hooked up the arcade buttons. There's nothing, and put it in a public space and have people play it. And all of a sudden we feel like people interact with this in yet another way than we had before. It's not a game controller, it has buttons. People immediately understand if there's only 2 buttons, which buttons they have to use. And they like huddle up together, right? Like getting 4 people crammed around an arcade is really tight, so they much more easily start like pushing each other or flicking each other's hands away. We ended up actually making an arcade out of IKEA cabinets where you could stand around where the screen is flat, which is yet another use of the space. And I like this one the most because people are actually, for the first time from all the other experiences, they're not everybody looking at the screen. You're still looking at the screen, but you're also looking at each other. It's much easier to look up because that's your natural position than to look to your side and be like, hey, you suck, don't get me this video. People are much more shouting at each other and like it's much more intimate space. And another example, this was at the Wild Rumpus and a bit of alright. So yeah, Lazy Nights taught me about how to use space in local multiplayer games, and not necessarily you don't necessarily have to build custom stuff, but you can build context. Even if your game is like a hardcore arcade game, you can still dress up your context. Like I really love what they did with the cowbell and the horn. It's like, yeah, the cowbell and the horn are fun, but there's also just like all these post-apocalyptic artifacts standing around. That the moment you step into this little corner of the expo, like something's happening here. Another thing that we learned in Lazy Nights is that tournaments and public events like here, expos are great. You find out about the games, you get to try everything, you get to talk to the developers. But something that I also really like are tournaments, not because of the competition, but because of the space and the setting they create. All of a sudden, all of us, just like here in this talk, we're all looking at somebody doing something, which is a much more memorable experience than, we'll all remember this expo, hopefully for the next couple of years. But how many games will you remember in 5 years specifically? But if we play a Lazy Nights tournament tonight in the pool, let's play a Lazy Nights tournament. We're all like the chances are that you might even remember who won, even if you were knocked out in the first round. If you stay engaged with it, and we experience this all together, and it's not about winning or losing. It's about focusing on something and doing that together. For me, at least. And I've actually been thinking that maybe it's not even about the tournament. It is about the sort of forceful paying attention to one game. So I'd be super interested to talk about other ways of doing this, because some people inherently dislike competition because they don't think they're good or whatever. To do something where at an expo or something, to forcefully put people in a room and make them look at a video game because it's a cool thing. But yeah, that's what we learned from Lazy Nights. Another project I did was the Chain Jam in collaboration with the Copenhagen Game Collective, which was a game jam where we had people submit local multiplayer games that followed a couple of rules, and then the Chain Jam would bundle them together and chain through them like a Mario Party type game. So this graphic actually explains it a little bit. You make a game, you submit it to the Chain Jam, it becomes part of this exquisite corpse or whatever you want to call it, and then the overarching Chain Jam game randomly selects them, and it actually saves your score from each individual game, and then presents you with like a high score list of like how well you did in all those games with a winner in total. Super interesting project. We ended up getting more than 60 submissions, and I don't think the game has been played more than like 10 times. So there's a lot of really interesting lessons there related to both what we tried to do, but also local multiplayer in general. The first thing I noticed is how many people thought this was an amazing idea and had so much energy for it. Like we got 60 submissions for something that like I didn't really advertise, I just posted it on Twitter and it took off. 60 submissions, that's probably over 100 people who were involved with this. And everybody just wanted to like create these like really tiny, so the Chain Jam, sorry I forgot to mention, the Chain Jam cuts you off after 1 minute. So your game could last longer, but after 1 minute it just goes to the next game. So most games actually took that as a constraint, and they made these 1 minute long, often incredibly weird local multiplayer experiences. And they also interpreted the constraints vastly differently to be like collaborative or competitive or weird, random, and text-based or whatever. But yeah, so there's a lot of energy. People seem to really love local multiplayer games. Like there's a revolution going on, they're saying, etc., etc. Another thing, the reason I think the Chain Jam that's the reason the Chain Jam was a success, but it was at the same time a little bit of a failure because it wasn't made accessible enough. So yeah, it looked like this. And you need 4 controllers, and you need to download an extra tool to set up your controllers so that they work. It's in your browser, and you need to install Flash and Unity and Java for all the games to work. So, you know, there's a pretty steep barrier, but then the other thing is there was no curation. So, local multiplayer games are great, but unfortunately not all local multiplayer games are great. So after a while, it really starts to, you know, when you have such a big selection, you can really figure out which are the ones that work better than others. And yeah, the accessibility is super important because people, like, you're in this social setting, people don't want to wait for somebody to mess around with controls or even to be explained something. You really want to get to the point really quickly. And there's some games that do this super well. They give you just enough space to figure it out on your own while you're already in the game, and even if you're playing with somebody who's way better. Another thing, this is not a game I made, but it's a game that made me think super hard and made me rethink a lot of stuff super hard. It's called Super Space Blank. I'm not sure it ever released, but it was in the IGF 2 years ago. In this game, it's also 4-player, but you can play less. The players are connected into a random shape. In this case, it's a square, but it could be like any Tetris shape. And you propel yourself by shooting, so if I shoot this way, I go that way. And we're all connected, so all of our bullet forces are added up together. So that sounds like it's a cooperative game, right? We have to work together to shoot enemies and stay in the game. But at the same time, when the game is over, it tells you how well everybody did individually. And you can actually steal points from each other. So this creates this really complicated relationship between competitiveness and collaboration. And what's interesting there is that, like, in local multiplayer, we usually talk about it as either being like collaborative, like Ibn Ob, or competitive, like Towerfall, Samurai Gun, all those games. But I think there's way more like unexplored territory there, like having to shift your mind from working together to working against each other, or and combinations and makeshift teams. It's actually something that Change End did as well. It's all of a sudden there's a game where the 4 players have to work together to get points at all. In the next game, they just have to kill each other. There's super like unexplored territory there for playing with those things. And Bernie de Koven actually said something really interesting recently, that in competitive games we have to be equal. Like if you look at top tier soccer players, they all look identical. The teams have the exact same lineup. But if you look at collaborative games, and there aren't even that many like popular collaborative sports, they're usually about challenges, and they're usually building on each other's strength. Like you're not just a chain with you know, where everybody's brought down by the weakest link. People have just completely different strengths, and you build on each other to, you know, for example, team building games are a really good example of that. Another game we made was Bonkel. This was for the Roskilde Festival. It was a room with 2 coffee tables with each 6 buttons with a color that could light up, and a very simple game with bouncing cubes. And the thing was, this was not, this was a music festival, people didn't come here to play video games. So Bonkel can be played by anything from 1 to 20 people, but at some point you're going to have to include more people. So it gives you a puzzle, sort of in a Guitar Hero type way, but much slower, where it goes like red, green, blue, and then there's like a karaoke ball that goes like, so you have to find red, green, blue. And at some point it goes like two red and 2 green, and maybe your table only has 1 red, and you have to go and talk to the people on the other table. With Bonkel, we learned, you know, we created even another space, and we found out that there's just different levels of engaging with local multiplayer games. Like, as a designer, or I at least often expect people to play in a certain way, and Bonkel was an amazing experience in seeing that like people will find their own way to play. So some people were just really content with playing this game single player until they got to this difficult puzzle, and then they just waited until until it was game over, and they just played that first party game. While other people immediately like stood up on the table and were like, guys, we have to work together, and like get more people in here and press all those buttons. And the game allowed for that. It was totally like, it was more of a like faded into the background, and like, and the people together are doing something, then like the game is super in the foreground. And I think everything about the custom controllers that I wanted to say has already been said. I talked to Lauren Gardner from Baby Castles, and she mentioned that custom controllers are cool because of 2 reasons. Suspension of disbelief and accessibility. Accessibility being everybody knows how to punch a bowl of custard. So like everybody knows how to punch a button, but because the things we use for input have so much context. Like my mom, who doesn't like to use a computer, when she sees a keyboard, she thinks, oh, I don't know how this works. And she immediately mentally like puts a barrier up. But if she sees a bowl of custard and I explain to her, you have to punch this bowl of custard to get points, And we have to do it as fast as possible. That's something like, there's no barrier, or I mean, there's probably a barrier there, but it comes from a very different, like, I don't want to touch sticky things, rather than like, I don't know how computers work. Do you know that this game is called Punch the Custard, made by George Buchanan from the UK, and it's literally about punching a bowl of custard as hard as possible. It has a sensor in it with a number that goes up. It's like the game, it's the digital part of it is completely the dumbest thing anybody has ever made. It says punch, and then at some point it says don't punch. If you punch when it says don't punch, you lose points. And then it says punch again, and you gain points for 1 minute. But yeah, so the accessibility of it is increased by creating custom controllers, because you can sort of force people to do things. You can force people to, understand more about your game, either by enforcing the theme. Like, you already know that it's going to be a post-apocalyptic game if there's just a bunch of like rusty stuff standing around, or there's bowls of custard, a bunch of towels, and a washing basin. You know what's going to happen. And the suspension of disbelief is like, people, are immersed, can very much easily immerse into the game if they're, because of the context or because of the way they interact with it. Another game we made, I'm almost done. This one was playable downstairs. I used to be a team building instructor for quite a long time, and one of my favorite things was to guide people who were blindfolded or otherwise handicapped through a bunch of, artificially handicapped, to guide them through a bunch of challenges. And we thought, why is that not a more popular video game mechanic? So we made this game called Zombie, about surviving the zombie apocalypse, where you blindfold a player and give him a gun in the form of a move controller or a cell phone, and they have to aim, and they can shoot, and they can reload, and more physical actions, like they could bash away, which isn't in there yet. And other people have to coach, so you can play this with 2 people, right, where you pick a coach. In the team building version, it's usually like you find the person, you try this out with multiple people, and you find the person that is your best coach. But we found out that it totally works as a party game as well, and that there's an interesting overlap, because sometimes you start as a party game. We could actually be playing it right now with 1 person in front and like 50 of you. So it's a really flexible thing, but at some point somebody's going to actually want to take the challenge and find a coach, so that it blends over from being a party game into a team building game. Interesting overlap. And what the lesson here is that, like, this inspiration didn't come from video games at all. Like, it's been said before, that try not to get too inspired by other games, because that way we're all just going to end up making the same games again. Like, try to find stuff that doesn't exist yet in video games and bring it in. And the other way around, go bring your video games other places. And the last thing I want to talk about is the project I'm currently working on, which I'm super excited about. It's called Glitch Golf. And in Glitch Golf, you have a smartphone and you have an iPad. And the iPad is on the ground and shows a mini golf track, and the phone is your swing. That doesn't maybe sound very exciting, right? It's a bit like Wii Golf, except that I put the screen on the ground, like, ooh, special. But what we learned, and we only learned by doing so, because of the way this technology is built, we can force people to behave with it in a certain way. For example, you're not going to step on the iPad, first of all, so what you're going to do is walk around it. And from the phone, we can only sense a rotation. We actually don't know where the phone is, so standing here or standing here doesn't make a difference. But of course you're going to stand close to the screen because you want to look at it. And it's immediately obvious that in mini golf, you look straight down. So people assume this position immediately because we use the mini golf like metaphor. And because we can sense the rotation of the device, and because they intuitively hold it straight, when they rotate the device, we know that they're probably walking around it rather than just turning around. So we can move the stick in the game like it's rotating, like the person is walking around the ball. I don't know, to me that was really mind-blowing when I saw that happening, that we can force people to behave in that way just by using both context and technology. And we can play that game whenever you want. I charged all my devices. So really quickly wrap up. So thinking about space has taught me a lot. Engage and activate other people to make local multiplayer games with you and play them, and also people engage in totally different ways, and trying to find maybe an underrepresented group can be really interesting. Think about collaboration and competition, and don't think of them as binary concepts. Accessibility is super important, and subvert device constraints, and get your inspiration from anywhere except from here. Or get inspired to get motivated to do stuff, but get your inspiration from outside. Thank you. Did I talk really fast? Yeah, any questions? I'd love to talk to you about like really complicated device stuff.
In terms of like accessibility, I mean, four-player games, especially local multiplayer, you can be able to pick it up and play almost immediately. So doesn't that like constrain your design choices as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's in a way like Tatiana said as well. Try to keep it simple because you have more problems than just making a fun game going on. So keeping it simple is a good, starting point. But also there's trying to think of a good example. But there's sort of like games that embed the tutorial in almost every game experience, but if you played it before, it sort of falls away immediately. So that like, a game like Towerfall Samurai Gun, you have to learn what the buttons are at some point, right? And I think Towerfall just shows you a pop-up, but I'm trying to think of a good example right now, but you can do so much more. You can sort of like try to interpret what the players are doing, or if they haven't moved for 5 seconds, you probably have to tell them how to move, and stuff like that, and find, have these sort of tiers of tutorial messages and stuff like that in there. But also with custom controllers, like an Xbox controller has like what, more than 12 buttons? If you only use 2, think about exhibiting your game with the button that only a controller that only has 2 buttons, or make one. Yeah, exactly. And of course, like I said, like I care about video game culture, not commercial, because like obviously you can't force people to buy a controller with only 2 buttons. So those are different problems as well. But if you want your game to thrive at an expo, like this, for example, or at other places, really try to take as many. Cut as many corners or like avoid areas of possible confusion as much as possible. Yeah. Cool. Thanks.